I'm Mo. It is November 9th and I finished 4 books so far in November, so it's definitely time to start another vlog-style monthly reading wrap-up. I do these every month where I try to tell you about the books that I've read in the month as close to when I've read them as possible, and lately I've definitely been slipping behind. I try to talk for about 5 minutes about each book, and I let you know what I thought of what I read in the month. The first book that I read in November was Ring Shout by P. Djeli Clark. I read this book on audio, and I think this book was on my 20 books I found out about in 2020 that I want to read in 2021 list, although I haven't looked at that list in a little while, so we'll have to go back and check how I'm doing on that one. I obviously didn't read it in 2021, but I still enjoy completing and reading the books on those lists. Ring Shout is an alternate history, a sci-fi horror book that takes place in the American South. It is a reimagining of the idea of the Ku Klux Klan and racism post-slavery, and how perhaps the Ku Klux Klan are actually aliens from another dimension who possess and repurpose people's hate to kill Black people. Luckily, a few people can see these monsters in their true form, even though they take the shape of humans, and they have set out to destroy them. Our main character is one of 3 women who can see these Ku Kluxes and hunt them down, and she is on a mission to do just that. She has some special abilities, including a magic sword that she can call from the ether, and she realizes that these special abilities also give her a connection to the Ku Kluxes. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, she's not entirely sure. So through this book we see her and her 2 companions fighting evil. We get to know a cast of characters and a little bit more about how this alternate history world works. It obviously has themes about racism and colorism, and about how different Black cultures were mixed and represented in the Americas at that time, how some were more or less discriminated against, and just generally like the history of that time wrapped up in this horror package of these 3 women battling these evil monsters. There's definitely a lot of gross scenes describing the monsters. One monster has all mouths all over his body. There's definitely some depiction of animal violence. Every single book has animal violence. Like I don't really understand why that's a thing. It would be an interesting video to make, maybe, like why there's so much animal violence in contemporary writing. This is a take on the chosen one trope in a way, because our main character is chosen. We're just not sure what she's chosen for. I liked that there were a lot of like taking tropes and turning them on their head. I liked that there was a strong friendship between the 3 monster fighters. They lost people in their lives or their way of life, and they were really fighting to get it back. Those scenes always really tug at my heart, and I definitely cried a little in parts in this book. Although Black people were freed as slaves, they were certainly not considered full members of society, and there's a little bit of interesting background and world building of the Black community having their own businesses and building their lives and building their community and business, which I thought was really interesting because I am fascinated with that time period. There were whole areas of community, whole cities, and that although Black Americans weren't integrated, they were definitely thriving in some ways because they were creating their own place to thrive. They were creating their own society and creating their own place, and they were communities, and they were trying their hardest to have a society of their own. And I find that part of our American history really interesting, and also obviously not told to people in America. I really did enjoy this book. I loved the world building. I loved the quick characterization. I've heard people comment that the characters weren't very fleshed out, but I thought they were great. I thought with a very short audiobook, only 4 or 5 hours long, they did a great job of really making you connect with each character and want to see what happens to them, and building the world that they all lived in, and really made me want to see more of that world. I would definitely read more books if this ever became a series or if there were ever companion books, and I would definitely read more of Clark's writing, because I think that this, especially being so short and so accessible was really fun. It wasn't as great a book for me as I had hoped it would be, but I think that it was probably because I like hyped myself up a little bit too much for it, and it wasn't as much of a scary horror as I hoped it would be. There were definitely some horrific moments, but overall it was pretty tame in my mind. That was the first book that I read in November, and I read that for Weekend Ween. So I finished it just after Weekend Ween was ended, and I do have a whole Halloween Weekend Ween Monster Mash vlog up on my channel, so I will list that down below. Another book that I read for Weekend Ween was Revenge by Yoko Ogawa. This is a book of interconnected short stories following basically one town or one area in Japan, and we start with a woman who lost her son going into a bakery to buy sweets to commemorate his birthday. And then each story is somehow connected to the last story. I can't really tell you the plot of them because they all have different plots, but all are connected in some way. Some are very small connections, maybe just one scene that you see from another angle. Some are an explanation from the previous story about something that was going on. Sometimes it's one half of a couple, you see their interaction one way and then you see it a different way. And I just really, really loved basically everything about this book. Although this is a book of interconnected short stories, you can't read the short stories alone. I mean, you can read the short stories alone. Each short story had its own contained plot, but this book only really makes sense if you read it all together, because that's the whole gimmick and fun of this book. It's very short, it's super compelling. Even if you're not interested in the stories, you definitely want to find out what the connection is to the next story or to the previous story, so you are driven through this whole book to keep reading and keep experiencing it, which is part of the fun of this book. These short stories are all extremely unsettling, creepy. This isn't horror in the epic, supernatural, mythic way, but it's just got so much creeping dread or bizarre scenes or unhappy, unsettling feelings that it definitely qualifies in my mind as a horror. Another interesting video I think to make would be to what horror is, because horror is such a weird genre, and I feel like during spooky season a lot of booktubers talk about that and what their idea of horror is, or what their take on horror is, or what they like or don't like in horror. So if you'd like to see a video of that from me, let me know in the comments below. And there's not much to say about Revenge except you should 100% go and read it if you like horror, if you like interconnected short stories, if you like small town stories and the idea of the connections between people in small towns, if you like unsettling stories. Just go read this one. This one's great. I think it's definitely going to make it to my top books of the year. I did read Revenge for Weekend Ween as well, and I finished this a few days after Weekend Ween, but it definitely was my favorite read of the readathon. The next book that I finished in November was Underfoot in Show Business by Helene Hanff. I have read two other Helene Hanff books in the past. I read 84 Charing Cross Road, and then earlier this year I read its companion, which is called The Duchess of Bloomsbury Street, which is a continuation of the story of 84 Charing Cross Road. Underfoot in Show Business is actually Helene's first book. It's also a nonfiction, and it tells the story of how she came to love the theater, how she wanted to be a writer and a playwright, how she got involved with the theater scene in New York, all her trials and tribulations with that, where she ended up as a writer. This book kind of goes from the 1920s and 30s to the 1970s and tells all about her life. Helene Hanff has just such a delightful writing style. I don't know how else to put it, but her writing style is just a little bit brash. She's definitely not adhering to gender roles or female expectations of the time, and her writing doesn't either. She talks about dating boys and smoking cigarettes and bumming money off of friends and couch surfing and all sorts of things that you wouldn't think a young woman in the 30s and 40s would be able to do, let alone would want to do, and about all her struggles with the misogynistic environment of playwriting and the theater in New York at this time as well. And again, her writing is just like so warm and wonderful and makes you feel like you're right there in it. I don't even like Broadway, like I'm not even into musicals, certainly not. And plays, sure, I like Shakespeare and other more classical plays, but I've never been a Broadway fiend. I've never wanted to be an actor in any capacity or a writer that deals with actors or anything like that. So even someone who comes from a totally different background and idea, who doesn't even like the things that she's talking about necessarily in a lot of this book was so fascinating and compelling and interesting and sweet and just wonderful to read. You can also see in Underfoot and Show Business a little bit of where 84 Charing Cross Road is going to come from. There's some sections of letters and there's some exploration of why she needed to be writing to 84 Charing Cross Road. It's a fun companion to that book. That book is incredibly short, maybe like 96 pages, and this one is only like 180 pages, and I just can't wait to read more of Helene's work. Her writing is just so wonderful, and I've been having such fun reading every book that she's written, and I plan to continue. The fourth book that I've read so far in November was A History of My Brief Body by Billy Ray Belcourt. This is a nonfiction memoir, poetry, essay collection of the true events of Billy Ray Belcourt's life. He is an Indigenous queer author from Canada, and he published a poetry book previous to this book that got really great reviews and was really well renowned. I haven't read that poetry book, but I wanted to read A History of My Brief Body, partly because the cover is gorgeous, and partly because I've heard good things of it, partly because it's Nonfiction November. It's also Indigathon, which has a different name. I don't have my phone, which has a different name, but I'll put the new name of Indigathon here. I will link to the Indigathon announcement video down below as well. You should definitely check that out. A History of My Brief Body is extremely short. It's a very interesting mix. It has very straightforward stories and episodes from Billy Ray's life. It has some things to do with his childhood. It has a lot to do with his college and young 20s years being a gay man. It has poetry and essay style passages of things that he thinks about and things that are important to him as an indigiqueer man living in Canada. It talks about the Canadian pipeline. It talks about the rampant and tragic suicide rate of Indigenous people in Canada and how that was declared a national emergency. It talks about Pulse and the mass shooting there. And it talks very frankly about sex and his experience with sex. So there's a lot of heavy topics in this book. And it's very difficult to read at some points. I read this book on audio and it was read by the author, and he has a very almost monotone style of speaking and writing, and with his Canadian accent and his Indigenous accent, it makes for a very weirdly soothing listen, even though he is talking about so many really difficult subject matters. I would say the only thing about reading this book on audio versus physical is I've never seen a physical copy of this book, but it's obvious that there are passages that are written more interestingly, more like a poem or more like vignettes or a chapter that's just one or two lines. So I think visually it's important to see this book as well, and I would definitely like to get my hands on a copy and reread this physically, because again, it is so short and there are so many important topics in it, and it is such a raw glimpse into Belcourt's life that I would definitely like to reread this one. This is a great one for November. It's a great Canadian Indigenous read if you only have a short amount of time, or if you are interested in the indigiqueer experience, especially as a gay man in Canada. I would highly recommend it. I do think that it's extremely difficult. This one brought tears to my eyes as well. So there are really, really hard topics in this, and I do think that the sex is quite explicit. So if you're not interested in hearing that, then that is definitely prevalent in this book. I am super glad that I read it, and I am excited to read more of his work. He just had another book that's either come out in November or is coming out in December. And those were the first 4 books that I read in November, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is November 20th, and I've done a terrible job at updating my November wrap-up. So the next book that I read in November was Cape May Ghost Stories, Book 2 by Charles J. Adams with research assistance by David J. Siebold. This is Book 2 of a nonfiction book of stories that the author has accumulated from people who live in Cape May, New Jersey, live and work there, and have experienced ghosts and ghostly apparitions and spooky things. I read the first of these books, I think in 2020, and then I recently found this book at a library sale, and I was super excited to read another one of these. These are definitely indie press, amateur, self-published type books, but they are all about Cape May, New Jersey, which is a Victorian town in very southern New Jersey, and it has a rich history. Many presidents visited there, and many different people lived there. And as a New Jersey resort town, it went through a lot of changes and fires and all sorts of interesting things that make sense that energies and ghosts are still lingering to this day. This book was written in the late 90s, so there's probably even more ghost stories, but I think there's only book 1 and book 2 in this series. This author has done a lot of ghost and history short nonfiction work around other places in New Jersey and places in nearby Pennsylvania. So if I ever found more of this person's work, I would definitely pick them up. They're definitely amateurish, they're definitely novice, they're definitely not well written at all, but they're super fun, and I like to read the stories and see if I can identify some of the places. I grew up with my family visiting Cape May, and then my husband and I visit Cape May as well. So we really enjoy that area of New Jersey, and it's fun to hear some ghost stories about that cute town. I read this for Nonfiction November, and it was a perfect short nonfiction read. I would only say to pick these up if you have some particular connection or attachment to Cape May, New Jersey. Otherwise, I don't think they're really worth anyone's time per se, unless maybe you're an amateur writer and you want to write about ghost stories, and then you could use this as inspiration. The next book that I read was Kitchen by Banana Yoshimoto. This was written in the 90s, and it is about a young girl who has already lost her mother and father and has been living with her grandmother. Unfortunately, her grandmother passes away. The great connection that she feels to her grandmother is their shared time in the kitchen. She's in the process of selling the house, and a young man who knew her grandmother comes to her and asks her to live with he and his mother. They have space in their house, they knew her grandmother, and they want to take her in and help her in this time of uncertainty. She does go and live with them, and this story is about her connection to them and how she gets over her grandmother's death, how she copes with her loneliness, and it's very much a reflection on loneliness in general and family and found family, and how having connections like she had a connection to her grandmother through the kitchen can lead to new opportunities to connection, because she does eventually become a cook and follow her dream, pursues her dream to work in kitchens. I only read the first novella in this book. It's very short. It was Banana Yoshimoto's first American published work. And then there's also a even shorter novella in the back called Moonlight Shadow. Now, in the book, it says that this is a connected story, but Moonlight Shadow was actually written before Kitchen, if you go through Banana Yoshimoto's wiki page or whatever, and that was her first published work that she published at just 19. So while I would like to read that book, I didn't think it was necessary. It seemed to me like the publishers just put out that book within Kitchen just so that they could bulk up her novella a little bit. I read this book for Novella November. I'd be happy to read Moonlight Shadow, but it didn't seem necessary to me to read them together. And also, I didn't love kitchen. I liked a lot of the ideas. There was transrep in this book. I really appreciated that. But the way the transrep was handled and the outcome of that storyline to me seemed extremely dated and a cliche of many queer stories, and I didn't really love that representation. Overall, although I liked many of the themes and ideas in the story, I didn't love the execution. It felt very scattered to me. It felt almost to me like the translation. This book was translated from the Japanese by Megan Bacchus, was not accurate or not correct. I feel bad saying that because I'm sure Bacchus did a fine job translating this, and maybe it's actually the author's style or cadence or manner of writing that I didn't really jive with. But to me, it felt like the translation was off. There would be passages where the main character was talking and then like 1 or 2 pages later she would immediately contradict what she was saying. But it didn't seem like that was intentional in the writing. It seemed like that was a mistake on the part of the translation. Again, I'm sure that's not what it is. I'm sure it was the author's style that I just didn't like, but I just didn't like it. So I will eventually read the other tiny novella in this book, but I needed to take a break because I didn't love this one. The next novella that I read for Novella November was Willa Cather's My Mortal Enemy. Now, I had been hearing about American modern classic writer Willa Cather for a while, and I really wanted to get my hands on her book, O Pioneers. She kind of writes books centered around Midwestern America in the early 1900s, and that's when she was writing. My Mortal Enemy is about a young woman who grows up in Midwestern America, but it's mostly about her vacation to Manhattan. She grows up hearing about a cousin who left the family fold and moved to New York. This cousin, Myra, shocks the family by letting her father disinherit her to be with the man she loves, and ever since then the family has kind of both appreciated her for her individualism and kind of shunned her for her controversy. Our main character is Myra's cousin's daughter and has been hearing these stories forever, and when Myra finally does come to visit, she is interested to find out if these stories are true. Myra invites the family to come to Manhattan, and our main character learns more about Myra's seemingly glamorous life, the consequences of abandoning her family, and the notion that perception is not always reality. So I really, really like this one. It's extremely short, only 105 pages. It had that modern classic feel. I loved seeing early 1900s New York. Myra lives on Madison Square Garden, which to me is a giant stadium because that's what it is now. And I knew that before it was a giant stadium, it was where the Manhattan main branch of the post office was, and they moved that to make the stadium. But I didn't realize that it was actually a garden at one point. It was a park, just like Bryant Park or Central Park or whatever. There's lots of parks in Manhattan, and this was originally a park with benches and trees and statues, and that was leveled, I think, to make the post office. So it was just a really interesting look at early Manhattan. The whole book kind of centers on the idea of people living without their means and overreaching their abilities, like to obtain a life that they dream of, but what happens if that life doesn't live up to what they were hoping? So it's definitely a character portrait of Myra and how she escaped her small town life and became a fancy lady in Manhattan. But did that satisfy her? I would definitely highly recommend this one. Extremely short, super easy to read. I read it in one day and I was super happy to do so, and now I can't wait to read more Willa Cather. And the next novella that I read was Breakfast at Tiffanys by Truman Capote. This is a reread for me, and I ended up rereading it because I just put out a couple of videos on novellas for Novella November, and one of the ones that I said was one of my favorite novellas pre-booktube was Breakfast at Tiffanys, but I really couldn't remember very much of this at all. And one thing that I didn't remember was this copy, my copy of it, has the novella itself and then it has 3 short stories. So I thought that the novella was 150 pages, but it's actually only 85 pages. When I reread this, I only reread the actual novella and I didn't read the additional 3 short stories. I don't think I've ever read the short stories actually, but since I'm doing that short story project, maybe these will be 3 that I read in the not too distant future. I had this remembrance of this book in my head that it was like extremely different from the film starring Audrey Hepburn. But it's not that different. There are some differences and small plot divergence. Not as much as I had recalled from originally reading this when I was like in my 20s. This book follows our main character. He is a writer. He takes an apartment in New York and he thinks he is like living the writer's life. He's so happy to have his ramshackle little apartment with his writing desk and his books and his pencils, but he hasn't sold a story yet and he is running out of money. Luckily, he finds a distraction in one of his new neighbors, Holly Golightly. Holly Golightly is a 20-year-old socialite flitting about Manhattan, living what seems like a dream life, going to parties, getting taken out to dinner all the time, always on a man's arm, given special privileges, strange little jobs, just because she's so charismatic and magnetic. Our main character becomes friends with her because Holly Golightly can never remember her apartment key and she's always buzzing neighbors' apartments to let her into her own apartment building. Our main character and Holly Golightly have a tumultuous relationship throughout this book. Although he is drawn to Holly, as many people are, he also realizes that she's basically a scammer and she's living hand to mouth. She's getting men to buy her dinner. She's throwing parties so that people will bring booze over, and she's actually extremely fragile and lonely, and he wonders if they're in the same situation and they can become fast friends. But because she has quite a hidden past and because she doesn't allow anyone to actually get close to her, they have their times where they are fighting or broken apart and then come back together. This story is almost a mystery, discovering Holly's past and seeing her life through the eyes of someone who can see through her charms. And in that way, it's very similar to the movie. There's line for line some of the exact same dialogue in the movie and the book, but there are subtle differences. And although there were problematic elements in the movie, there's different problematic elements in the book. They definitely say the N-word. The whole aspect of Holly scamming people, trying to become rich and privileged through manipulating men and other people in her life. Trigger warnings too for miscarriage, statutory rape, for child endangerment, just tons of things in this that you wouldn't necessarily expect but are definitely in there. Overall, I ended up really liking this book upon reread. It helped me remember why I like this book so much. I enjoyed that the aspects that were different from the movie set it apart, was a little bit more in depth, a little bit more thought-provoking than the movie. But I have to say that the best part for me was that the cat in this book, Cat, or Poor Slob, as Holly often calls him, does not end up with an unhappy ending. And that was the 8th book that I read in November, and when I read some more, I will let you know. It is November 23rd, and last week I finished one more book in November. I finished Lots Away by Darcy Littlebadger. I was reading this partly for the Skoden readathon, where you read as many Indigenous authors as you can or want. I've been hearing about Darcy Littlebadger for quite a while and seeing the cover for Lots Away for a while, and I was interested in it, but I thought it was going to be more of like a middle grade book. I think just based on the cover, that's what I was expecting. But Lots Away is much more of a young adult book. It's told in a very simple, plain, and easy to read way, but a lot of the themes are quite dark. So although I think in the storytelling it could feel middle grade, in the themes and content I think it's much more young adult. I read this on audio, and I'm glad I did because I don't know if I would have made it through if I had been reading this book physically. I was also reading another YA book, which I'll talk about in a second, and so I wasn't super into YA, and it was a little bit of a struggle for me to get through. Elatsoe follows Elatsoe, also known as Ellie, as she navigates her young adult teenage years as a Native American person in the modern day. But this story also tells of Ellie's ability to talk to ghosts and to raise ghosts, and the traditional Native American myths and legends and heritage and magic that exists in the universe of Elatsoe. Her best friend is her dog Kirby, who died several years ago, but she was able to raise his ghost. She does get nervous, and she knows that when bad things happen to her family members, she gets visions, or Kirby lets her know that something's going on, and so when Kirby starts acting up, she's worried for her family. Luckily, her immediate family are doing fine, but she comes to find out that her cousin was killed in a car crash. The car crash seems a little bit suspicious, and when her cousin visits her in a dream, Ellie comes to understand that this was no accident, that this might have been murder. So this story follows Ellie and her best friend Kirby and her parents as they go down to help her cousin's wife and help with their baby cousin and make sure that everything goes well for the funeral. But Ellie also intends to bring her cousin's murderer to justice. This was a really interesting story, and it reminded me a lot of Pet by BXXKmas. It has that idea where you're living in reality and you're in current day. There's cell phones, there's, cars, there's everything that you can think of, but magic also exists, and monsters exist, and different people exist. In Elatsoe, there are vampires, there are different creatures. In Elatsoe, there are people who can perform magic, there are people who can raise the dead, and one of the key rules of Ellie's ghost raising power is not to raise a human ghost. So although it is tempting for Ellie to raise her cousin's ghost, she knows that that could only cause more trouble and more pain. So she has to figure out what happened to her cousin and who's responsible by her own means. Similarly to the way I liked it in Pet, I really enjoyed the realistic, not realistic, magic, fantasy elements of this story. I liked Ellie as a character. She's very brash. She's very sure of herself at 16 or 17. She thinks that she knows best and that she knows how to protect herself, but she's very kind and supportive and encouraging to all her family and friends. She can empathize even with people that she knows are doing the wrong thing. I enjoyed a lot of aspects of this book, but overall I do think it was a little too young for me. There were parts where Ellie cursed, or there was obviously extremely mature subject matter happening, but it was told in a very childish, simple way, which I didn't really vibe with. I'm glad to have read it, and I would definitely read more by Darcy Littlebadger. I know she has another young adult / middle grade book, so I would be interested in trying that. Short stories, poems, or perhaps an adult novel from her would probably be more my vibe. This morning I finished Vampires Never Get Old, Tales with a Fresh Bite, edited by Zoraida Cordova and Natalie C. Parker, and this is an anthology of short stories and essays all about vampires and new modern takes on the classic vampire myths. There's lots of different authors in here, including Donnell Clayton, Tessa Gratton, Rebecca Rowanhorse, Fee Schwab, and this was my TBR tackle book for November. I do love vampires, and there were a lot of authors in this collection that I have been wanting to try. These are all people that I've heard good things about their books, but they mostly write YA, so I haven't picked their books up yet. This is a collection of YA short stories. I liked that there were short essays by the editors after each short story, and although they were very leading YA type, what does this make you think about young person essays, I enjoyed that they picked out certain aspects of why they chose each story. Each story in this collection is a new take and specifically underutilized perspective on vampire mythos. So for instance, there is a short story in here that has to do with disability. There is many queer stories in this collection. There are stories of people of color and by people of color. Just like all short story collections, some of these I really enjoyed, some of them I didn't like so much, some of them you could tell were written by more practiced and skilled writers, some of them were hokier, sillier, some of them were in that writer's style, and some of them were experimental. I didn't realize going in that they were going to be all young adults, so I was glad to parse this book out and read a few stories every week or a story every day, because I think altogether the angstiness of the YA experience would have been really annoying for me, and especially reading it with another YA book a lots away, I was like over YA, and YA it's not for me. I'm happy to have read it, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is November 27th, and I have finished 2 more books in November. I finished Seed Folks by Paul Fleischman. This is a middle grade young adult short book written in the 90s, and it is about a group of people who turn a vacant lot in a poor area of Cleveland into a community garden. It is done in short chapters with the name of the person, and it gives a little bit of their backstory, and then how they started the garden, why they started the garden, what the results of starting a community garden in a poor neighborhood is. It was very cute and sweet. It definitely was a little bit dated, and there were a couple of things that were a little iffy about it. There was one person's perspective that was told in a potentially racist way. Mostly it's about tolerance and peace and understanding and coming together as a community and helping each other and creating a space where people and plants can grow. Sometimes an author writes with the best of intentions, but due to the timeliness of the book or the time period that you come to the book, it might be more problematic than was intended. I did enjoy the illustrations, and I liked the story overall. The next book that I finished is Here by Richard McGuire. This is a graphic novel about a house. It seems to be on the East Coast. It is a historic site across from a house that Benjamin Franklin lived in, and it's told in a really interesting way where all the pages are from the same perspective of the house, but they span through many different timelines. So you have the overall picture and the year in the top corner from when that picture is. This one happens to be 1944. And then you have little windows and panels into other time periods in that same space. So there's one on this page from 1992, from 1969, from 1933, from 1992 again, and it goes through like that. Some of the pages are from millions of years ago, some of them are from the current day when this was written in 2014, and then there are also glimpses at the future. So here's one of the prehistoric pages, and here's one of the future pages. And it tells multiple stories of people who lived in the house over time, or at least snippets of their stories. You never get a complete storyline from start to finish, except of the house itself. I picked this up in a little free library. It was someone's gift, so it has a gift note card in there. I enjoyed it. I liked the kind of photographic, emulated style of the illustrations of the people, and I liked the more graphic design style of the depiction of the house. I really liked the pages from like the prehistoric era and the use of the entire page to depict the house, and I liked finding out about this story of the house non-linearly. I read both of these books for the Bloomin Readathon, and those were 2 more books that I've read in November. It is November 28th, and I have finished 2 more books in November. I finished the 1913 Patterson Silk Strikes The Children's Story by Angelica M. Santomoro and Evelyn M. Hershey. Both M middle names. I wonder what they are. Maybe they're Mo. I doubt it. This is a dramatized nonfiction. It does follow characters in the book that didn't exist but were based on real people, but very, very loosely follows them. It mostly just tells the story of the 1913 Patterson silk strike. This book is not on Goodreads. It was created for the Labor Museum in New Jersey, which I didn't know was a thing. I picked this book up in a little free library or at a book sale because I thought it looked interesting, and it was a nonfiction about New Jersey, which I've been trying to read for Nonfiction November. I didn't know anything about any of the history that was involved in this. I didn't know that Patterson was a huge epicenter of silk factories. I didn't know that the Patterson waterfall, which is a well-known New Jersey landscape, was used to create energy, so that was super interesting. I didn't know that there was a labor museum in New Jersey, and now I do want to go visit it. So overall, this was like a super informative and interesting book. It's not going to count towards my Goodreads goal, unfortunately, so I'll just have to add it in at the end, but I really did enjoy it. I like that it had some more information about other labor strikes in the back. I like that it had some fun facts, which were not that fun. I like that it had a glossary of terms for kids. When I did try to look for it on Goodreads, I saw that there were some other nonfiction books about this event made for adults, so I would like to maybe go and read more about the silk strikes and how they affected labor and labor unions. Super interesting. And then I also read Bill Bryson's African Diary. This is a super short little nonfiction book about Bill Bryson taking a trip to Africa for the CARE organization, which is an aid organization that helps impoverished people all over the world and specifically focuses on women and girls and helping small women-run businesses get loans so that they can improve their business and improve their lives. This particular book, Bill Bryson was asked by CARE to write this small book, and then it was sold as a way to make a donation to the CARE organization, and you would get the book as a souvenir. I have a love-hate relationship with Bill Bryson. I have really, really enjoyed some of his work, and I have absolutely hated some of his work. This one was kind of in the middle. It's obviously very small and slim and put together for free with his time and skills. His humor didn't really hit in this. It wasn't a very nuanced read. It reminded me a lot of Last Chance to See by Douglas Adams, where Douglas Adams went to Africa and other countries to investigate endangered animals. And it was kind of Bill Bryson doing that, but with people, but also not as like emotionally charged or invested as Douglas Adams was in animals. It did teach me a few things that I didn't know about Kenya and Nairobi. Obviously, this book is quite dated because it was written in 2002, but I am super interested in Kenya, the cultures there, so any information that I can get from books about that country is interesting to me. Overall, I'm glad that I read it. I'm glad to have been introduced to the CARE organization. I'm glad to learn a little bit more about Africa and Kenya in general. It was a super quick read to read for the Bloomin Readathon and Nonfiction November. When I read some more, I'll let you know. It is December, and I finished one more book in November. I finished Monkey Beach by Eden Robinson. Eden Robinson is a Native Canadian author, and this follows a Native Canadian girl, Lisa Marie, as she finds out that her brother has gone missing. While she's waiting and looking for her brother, it's a recollection of her life and the tragedies that she's gone through, how she's dealt with them, how her family has come together and spread apart, how they have been there for each other or not been there for each other, and it's all about her dealing with grief and how she has a special ability to know when bad things are going to happen, and that at first she really hates this ability and wishes it would go away, and then later in life wishes that she had appreciated it more in her youth. The book has parts, and then within those parts we see Lisa Marie in the present while she's looking for her brother, Lisa Marie growing up over time, and also snippets of location identities, where you are, what a place means, what the significance of something is. It's not told entirely linearly in any of those parts, but they all do build on each other and connect and come together. Definitely talks about racism and poverty and the idea of living within an Indigenous community and how that can be harder than living within other communities, how Canadian culture can be like segregated appreciated how especially the lives of young Indigenous girls and women are threatened constantly. This book was on my 21 books I found out about in 2021 and I wanted to read in 2022, so it's probably the last of those books that I'm going to get to in 2022, and I really, really enjoyed it. I loved the writing style. The subject matter was interesting. I didn't love always hearing from a child's perspective when we heard about Lisa Marie as a child, but I thought that as a whole it all worked together really well, and there was enough other parts or interesting things about her family that made up for the fact that we had to read from this child's perspective a lot of the time. I would definitely love to read more from Eden Robinson. This book was published in 2000, so I would also really like to read something a little bit more current and see how her style has changed. That was the 15th book that I read in November. That definitely makes November my largest reading month as far as number of books in 2022 and since I've started BookTube, and I read a lot of great things. It was a great reading month. I read a lot of very, very short things, including one picture book, which I don't usually talk about, but I did talk about a little bit. I read a bunch of nonfiction. I read a collection of short stories. I read a graphic novel. I read some modern classics. I read a horror disturbing book. I read a lot of books with queer representation in them. I made a full board bingo for the Bloomin Readathon. I read for Skoden and Indigathon. I read 3 audiobooks that fit into various things. I read for Nonfiction November. I had a reread. I read a new American author that I've been wanting to read. Overall, it was a really great reading month. It wasn't as wonderful and exciting and stunning and beautiful as my October reading, but I did read a lot of things that I really, really love and will reread, or things that I've been meaning to get to, or good books in general. So that was my November reading. Let me know what you read in November. Let me know how many books you read and which was your favorite. And I will see you soon in another video. Thanks so much for joining me today. Bye!